The guard shoved her forward one last time, and her knees struck the polished stone floor hard enough to make her teeth click. She tasted copper. Around her the throne room stretched vast and cold, columns rising like accusations, and somewhere above her the emperor waited on a seat she wasn't permitted to see. The voice that spoke next came from everywhere at once, amplified through architecture and ritual until it felt like the bones of the palace itself were speaking. "Kneel," it said. "Acknowledge the dominion you cannot escape." She stayed down for 3 breaths, feeling the bruises bloom across her shins, feeling the weight of 100 alien eyes on the back of her skull. Then she moved her left foot forward, planted it flat, and began to rise. Her name was Dr. Marena Cole, and she had been a civilian xenoarchaeologist stationed on a survey outpost near the Helix Nebula when the Kavrathi armada arrived. She hadn't fired a weapon or issued an order. She'd been cataloging pottery shards from a dead culture when the bombardment began. The evacuation shuttle left without her. She'd spent 4 days in a collapsing research facility, rationing water and listening to the pulse of distant engines overhead, before a Kavrathi boarding team found her crouched in a storage closet holding a data tablet like a shield. They dragged her onto a transport, stripped her of her tools, and locked her in a cell so small she could touch both walls at once. That was 6 months ago. Since then she had been moved 17 times, always in the dark, always in silence. Until finally she'd been brought here to the capital world of Kavraxis Prime, marched through streets lined with crowds that hissed and jeered, and delivered to this throne room to play her assigned role in someone else's theater. The emperor's name was Sorvath the 18th, and his reign had lasted 93 standard years. He ruled an empire that spanned 200 star systems, commanded fleets that turned planets to glass, and presided over a court where every gesture was choreographed and every word was law. Marena had learned these facts from the guards who spoke freely in front of her, assuming she couldn't understand their language. She could. She'd been studying Kavrathi dialects for 7 years. She knew the word for crown, the word for chain, and the word for defiance. She also knew that the emperor had never been contradicted in public, not once, not in nearly a century. The guards expected her to kneel. The court expected her to weep or beg or break. Instead, she stood slowly, her legs trembling from the effort, and looked up. The throne sat on a raised dais at the far end of the hall, carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to drink the light. Sorvath himself was smaller than she'd imagined, his body encased in ceremonial armor that made him look like a sculpture rather than a living being. His face was pale and lined, his eyes the color of old ice. On his head rested the crown, a circlet of interlocking metal bands that pulsed faintly with embedded bioluminescent threads, a relic from the first Kavrathi emperor who had unified the clans 3,000 years ago. It was not ornamental. It was the symbol of absolute power, the object every pretender to the throne had died trying to claim. Marena had read about it in restricted archives during her graduate work. She knew it was supposed to be unbreakable. She also knew it was just metal. The silence in the hall stretched thin and brittle. Sorvath leaned forward slightly, his fingers gripping the armrests of the throne. "You were ordered to kneel," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer amplified and somehow more dangerous for it. Marena met his gaze and said nothing. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, but she kept her face still. One of the guards moved toward her, raising a shock prod, but Sorvath raised one hand and the guard froze mid-step. "Interesting," the emperor said. "The human has forgotten her place." He tilted his head, studying her the way a biologist might study a specimen pinned to a board. Or perhaps she never knew it. Marena took a breath and spoke in flawless Kavrathi, each syllable deliberate. "I know exactly where I am," she said. "I'm standing in a room full of people who are about to watch you make a mistake." The murmur that rippled through the court was immediate and sharp, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. Sorvath's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened on the armrests and the faint hum of the bioluminescent threads in the crown grew louder. "You speak our language," he said. It wasn't a question. Marena nodded. "I've been speaking it for years," she said. "I've read your histories. I've studied your wars. I know what this crown represents." She paused, letting the words settle. "I also know it's not yours anymore." The guards moved then, 3 of them converging on her from different angles, but Marena had already calculated the distance. She lunged forward, not away, her body low and fast, and her fingers closed around the lowest step of the dais before the first guard could reach her. She vaulted upward, using momentum and desperation in equal measure, and her hand shot out toward the crown. Sorvath jerked back, but he was old and slow, and she was faster. Her fingers caught the edge of the circlet and yanked it free. The bioluminescent threads flared once, brilliant and blinding, and then dimmed to a soft glow in her grip. She landed hard on the dais, her shoulders slamming into the stone, and rolled to her feet. The guards stopped. Every person in the hall stopped. Marena stood there, breathing hard, the crown balanced in both hands, and looked down at Sorvath. The Emperor's face had gone pale, his mouth open but no sound emerging. For the first time in 93 years he looked uncertain. Marena lifted the crown slowly, deliberately, and placed it on her own head. The metal settled against her temples, cool and surprisingly light, and the bioluminescent threads brightened again, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She turned to face the court, the assembled nobles and generals and functionaries who had spent their lives bowing to the man behind her, and asked in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "Who kneels next?" No one moved. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that presses against the eardrums and makes the air feel thick. Marena's legs were shaking, and her shoulder throbbed where she'd hit the stone, but she kept her spine straight and her gaze level. She had no plan beyond this moment, no strategy that extended past the next breath, but she had learned one thing in 6 months of captivity. Power wasn't something you were given. It was something you took when everyone else hesitated. A single voice broke the silence, low and rasping, from somewhere near the back of the hall. "This is sacrilege," the voice said, and Marena turned her head just enough to see a robed figure stepping forward, an advisor or priest, she couldn't tell which. "The crown cannot be stolen," the figure continued. "It must be bestowed by blood or conquest. You are neither heir nor conqueror. You are a prisoner, a trophy." Marena let the words hang for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then conquer me," she said. "Take it back." The advisor stopped, his mouth working soundlessly. Marena shifted her weight, feeling the crown press against her skull, and spoke again, louder this time. "You dragged me here to humiliate me," she said, "to show your people that humanity could be broken, but you made a mistake. You brought me to the heart of your empire and put me in the same room as the one thing you worship more than anything else, and now I'm holding it." She turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "So here's what happens next. You can try to kill me. Maybe you'll succeed. But the moment you do, everyone in this room will know that your emperor couldn't protect his own crown from one unarmed human, or you can listen." The murmur that followed was louder now, a buzz of overlapping voices that sounded like confusion and anger in equal measure. Sorvath rose unsteadily from his throne, his hands trembling, and pointed one long finger at Marena. "You will die for this," he said, his voice shaking. "Slowly, publicly. I will make an example of you that will echo across every world we control." Marena looked at him, this ancient man who had ruled longer than she'd been alive, and felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not defiance, something colder and sharper. "You already tried that," she said quietly. "It didn't work." She turned away from him, dismissing him with the gesture, and addressed the court again. 6 months ago your ships destroyed my outpost and killed 19 people I worked with. You took me because I was convenient. Because I was there. I wasn't a soldier or a leader. I was just someone who studied the past. But you made me stand here and you made me watch while you celebrated your own power. And now I'm going to tell you what I learned. She paused, letting the weight of the moment build. Your empire is dying, not because of humanity, not because of rebellion, because you've forgotten what this crown is supposed to mean. The advisor who had spoken before stepped forward again, his face flushed with anger. You know nothing, he hissed. You are ignorant of our traditions, our history, our sacred. Marena cut him off. I know you fought a civil war 2 centuries ago that killed 1 billion people. I know your outer colonies are starving because you divert their resources to the core worlds. I know your fleet commanders are embezzling supplies and your governors are selling military secrets to rival factions. I know because I read your own reports. She tilted her head slightly, the crown catching the light. Your archives aren't as secure as you think. That got a reaction. Voices rose in alarm and denial, and several nobles turned to glare at the advisor who looked stricken. Marena pressed the advantage. You're not an empire anymore, she said. You're a performance, and you're so busy maintaining the illusion that you've stopped noticing the cracks. She looked directly at Sorvath. Your reign has lasted 93 years. How many of those years did you spend actually governing? How many did you spend sitting on that throne and letting other people make decisions in your name? Sorvath's face twisted with fury and he gestured sharply to the guards. Enough, he snarled. Kill her, now. But the guards didn't move. Marena saw the hesitation in their stances, the way their eyes flicked from her to the emperor to each other. One of them, a young officer with a scar across his jaw, took a half-step forward and then stopped. Your Majesty, he said slowly, the crown, Sorvath spun on him. I gave you an order. The officer flinched but didn't raise his weapon. The crown chooses, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That is the law. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted over each other, some demanding Marena's execution, others calling for the officer to be arrested, and a very few, standing in stunned silence as if they just witnessed something they couldn't name. Marena stayed where she was, the crown still resting on her head, and waited for the noise to crest and break. When it finally ebbed, she spoke again, her voice cutting through the residual murmur like a blade. I'm not here to rule you, she said. I don't want your throne, I don't want your empire, but I'm not going to kneel either, not to him, not to anyone. She turned to Sorvath, who was gripping the armrests of the throne so hard his knuckles had gone white. You want this back? She asked, lifting one hand to touch the crown. Then earn it. The emperor stared at her, his chest heaving, and for a long moment Marena thought he might actually lunge at her. But then something in his face changed, a flicker of something she couldn't quite read, fear or doubt or maybe just exhaustion, and he sank back into his seat. What do you want? He asked, his voice flat and hollow. Marena took a breath. This was the moment. This was the question she'd been waiting for. I want you to listen, she said. Not to me, to them. She gestured toward the court, toward the nobles and officers and advisors who were still watching in shock. You've spent so long demanding obedience that you've stopped hearing anything else, but they're trying to tell you something. They have been for years. You just haven't been listening. Sorvath's eyes narrowed. And what are they trying to tell me? Marena met his gaze. That this doesn't work anymore, she said simply. That the empire you built is collapsing under its own weight. That people are suffering and dying while you sit here pretending everything is fine. That you can't hold this together with fear and ritual alone. She paused, letting the words sink in. You need something new, or you need to let someone else build it. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the stunned quiet of shock, but something heavier, something that felt like the air before a storm. Marina could see the calculation in Sorvath's eyes, the way he was weighing her words against his pride, his legacy, his long years of absolute power. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "And if I refuse?" Marina shrugged. "Then I walk out of here wearing this," she said, tapping the crown lightly. "And I find someone who will listen. Maybe one of your governors, maybe one of your fleet commanders, maybe just the people in the streets who are tired of starving while you hoard resources. Someone will." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "You can't stop me anymore, not without proving that everything I just said is true." Sorvath closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they looked older, more tired, as if the weight of 93 years had finally caught up with him all at once. "You are either the bravest fool I have ever met," he said quietly, "or the most dangerous." Marina smiled faintly. "Maybe both," she said. She reached up and carefully lifted the crown from her head, holding it between them. "But I'm also the person who just gave you a choice. You can take this back and keep pretending, or you can do something different." She extended the crown toward him, her hand steady. Sorvath stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at her face. "Why would you give it back?" he asked. Marina thought about the 19 people who had died on the outpost, the 6 months she'd spent in cells barely large enough to breathe, the guards who had shoved her to the floor, and the voice that had commanded her to kneel. She thought about all the ways power could break a person and all the ways it could be reclaimed. "Because keeping it doesn't change anything," she said. "But what happens next might." Sorvath reached out slowly and took the crown from her hands. The bioluminescent threads flickered as he held it, their light uncertain. He turned it over once, studying it as if seeing it for the first time, then looked back at Marina. "You said you studied our history," he said. "Then you know what happens to those who challenge the throne." Marina nodded. "I do," she said. "But I also know what happens to empires that stop evolving. They fall, and they take everyone with them." Sorvath was silent for a long time. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "You will be taken to a secure location. You will be provided with access to our records, our reports, everything you claim to have read, and you will prepare a proposal." He set the crown carefully on the armrest of the throne, his hand lingering on it for a moment. "If your assessment is accurate, if you can show me a path forward that preserves what we have built while addressing what you claim is broken, I will consider it." He paused, his eyes hard. "But if you are wrong, if this is merely the arrogance of a captive grasping for leverage, you will be executed, publicly, as I promised." Marina felt the weight of the bargain settle over her. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even safety. But it was a chance, and that was more than she'd had an hour ago. "Agreed," she said. Sorvath gestured to the guards, who moved forward cautiously as if approaching something volatile. "Take her to the archive wing," he said. "Assign her quarters. See that she has everything she requires." He looked at Marina one last time. "Do not make me regret this, Dr. Cole." Marina inclined her head slightly. "I'll do my best," she said. Then the guards surrounded her, and she was led from the hall, the crown still resting on the armrest where Sorvath had left it, its light pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The quarters they assigned her were larger than the cells she'd been kept in, but still sparse. A single room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the capital city. The guards left her there with a data terminal and a pile of access codes, then stationed themselves outside the door. Marina sat at the desk and stared at the terminal for a long time, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd bought herself time. She'd turned a public execution into a negotiation, but she had no idea if she could actually deliver on the promise she'd made. She activated the terminal and began sifting through the files. There were thousands of them, reports and ledgers and classified communications stretching back decades. She started with the outer colonies, the systems farthest from Kavrath's prime, and within an hour she found what she was looking for. Famine reports suppressed by local governors. Supply shipments diverted to core worlds. Entire populations abandoned to starvation while the capital celebrated its victories. It was worse than she'd guessed. The empire wasn't just dying. It was already dead in places, the corpse still moving because no one had told it to stop. Marena worked through the night, taking notes, cross-referencing data, building a picture of what the Kavrathi Empire had become. By dawn, she had the outline of a proposal, fragile and incomplete but real. It centered on three principles: transparency in resource distribution, local governance for the outer colonies, and accountability for those in power. It wouldn't be popular with the nobles. It would be even less popular with the emperor himself. But it might work, if she could convince them to try. She slept for a few hours and woke to the sound of the door opening. One of the guards stepped inside, a different one this time, older and carrying a tray of food. "Dr. Cole," the guard said, setting the tray on the desk. "The Emperor has requested your presence in the council chamber this evening. You are to present your findings." Marena nodded, her stomach tightening. "Thank you," she said. The guard hesitated, then spoke again, his voice lower. "For what it's worth," he said, "some of us are hoping you're right." He left before she could respond. The council chamber was smaller than the throne room, but no less imposing. Its walls lined with portraits of previous emperors, and its ceiling vaulted high enough to echo. Sorvath sat at the head of a long table, the crown once again on his head, and around him sat a dozen advisors and generals, their faces ranging from curious to hostile. Marena stood at the opposite end of the table, the data terminal in her hands, and waited for Sorvath to speak. "Proceed," he said finally, his voice flat. Marena activated the terminal and projected the first set of data onto the wall behind her. "This is the current state of your outer colonies," she said, and began to walk them through the evidence. She spoke for nearly an hour, methodical and precise, laying out the numbers and the patterns and the failures. She showed them the supply diversions, the falsified reports, the systems on the brink of collapse. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't try to soften the blow. She simply presented the facts and let them speak for themselves. When she finished, the room was silent. One of the generals, a broad-shouldered woman with graying hair, leaned forward and spoke, her voice tight with anger. "You're accusing us of negligence," she said. Marena shook her head. "I'm accusing the system of negligence," she said. "You've built an empire that prioritizes the core at the expense of the periphery. It's not sustainable, and it's killing people." Another advisor, a thin man with sharp features, scoffed. "And what would you have us do?" he asked. "Dismantle everything we've built. Hand power to the colonies and watch them tear each other apart." Marena met his gaze. "No," she said. "I'd have you give them a voice. Let them govern themselves in matters that affect them directly. Keep the military centralized but make the economy local. Share the resources instead of hoarding them. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than what you're doing now." Sorvath drummed his fingers on the table, his expression unreadable. "You're asking us to relinquish control," he said. Marena nodded. "I'm asking you to trust the people you govern," she said, "or at least to stop starving them." She paused, then added, "If you don't, someone else will, and it won't be peaceful." The room erupted into argument, voices overlapping as the advisors shouted at each other and at her. Marena stood still, letting the chaos wash over her, and waited for it to subside. Finally, Sorvath raised one hand and the noise died. "Enough," he said. He looked at Marena, his eyes cold but thoughtful. "You've given us much to consider," he said. "We will deliberate. You will return to your quarters and await our decision." Marena spent the next 3 days in isolation. Her only contact, the guards who brought her meals, and the data terminal that had become both her tool and her lifeline. She refined the proposal, added contingencies, tried to anticipate every objection they might raise. On the 4th day, Sorvath summoned her again, this time to the throne room. She walked in to find the court assembled as before, the same faces watching her with the same mix of hostility and curiosity. Sorvath stood from his throne as she approached, the crown gleaming on his head, and Marena felt her pulse quicken. "Dr. Cole," Sorvath said, his voice formal and measured, "we have reviewed your proposal, we have debated its merits and its risks, and we have reached a decision." He paused, letting the tension build, and Marena forced herself to breathe. "Your assessment of our situation is largely accurate," Sorvath continued. "Your proposed solutions are radical and fraught with peril, but they are not without merit." He stepped down from the dais, moving closer to her, and Marena saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before, something that might have been respect. "We will implement a trial program," he said. "3 outer colonies will be granted limited autonomy in economic matters. Resources will be redistributed according to need rather than proximity to the core. Governors who falsify reports will be removed and prosecuted." He stopped a few paces from her, his gaze steady. "This is not surrender," he said. "This is adaptation. And if it fails, the responsibility will be yours." Marena felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Understood," she said. Sorvath nodded slowly, then turned to address the court. "Dr. Cole will remain on Kavrathis Prime as an advisor," he said. "She will oversee the implementation of these reforms and report directly to this council. Any who obstruct her work will answer to me." He looked back at Marena. "You wanted to be heard," he said. "Now you will be. Do not waste the opportunity." Marena inclined her head. "I won't," she said. Sorvath returned to his throne and sat, the crown settling on his head like a weight. "You may go," he said. Marena turned and walked from the hall, her legs steady now, her mind already racing with the work ahead. As she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her, low and almost amused. "Dr. Cole." She stopped and looked back. Sorvath was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, watching her with something that might have been a smile. "You were right," he said, "about the crown. It is just metal, but sometimes that's enough." The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings and negotiations and small, hard-won victories. Marena worked with the council to draft new policies, traveled to the outer colonies to meet with local leaders, and spent her evenings poring over reports and refining strategies. The work was exhausting and often frustrating, but it was also real. She could see the changes taking shape, could see the way people responded when they realized someone was actually listening. The trial program expanded to 6 colonies, then 10. Resource distribution improved. Starvation rates dropped. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks and resistance and moments when Marena thought the whole fragile structure might collapse. But it held. 6 months after she'd stood in the throne room and placed the crown on her own head, Marena received a message from Sorvath requesting her presence in his private chambers. She went, unsure what to expect, and found him sitting by a window overlooking the city, the crown resting on a table beside him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. Marena sat. Sorvath was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. "I have ruled for 93 years, he said finally. "I have seen wars and famines and rebellions. I have made decisions that saved millions and decisions that doomed them. And in all that time, I never once questioned whether the system itself was broken." He turned to look at her. "You did that in less than an hour." Marena didn't know what to say. Sorvath smiled faintly. "I am old," he said. "Too old to change as much as this empire needs to change, but I can begin the process. And I can ensure that those who come after me continue it." He picked up the crown and turned it over in his hands, the bioluminescent threads pulsing softly. "This has been worn by 18 emperors," he said. "Each one believed it made them invincible. Each one was wrong." He set it down again and looked at Marena. "You wore it for less than a minute, and in that time you did more to shake this empire than any conqueror ever has." Marena felt her throat tighten. "I didn't do it to shake anything," she said quietly. I did it because I was tired of kneeling. Sorvath nodded slowly. I know, he said. That's why it worked. He stood, moving to the window, and gestured for her to join him. Together they looked out over the city, the lights of Kavraxis Prime spreading like stars across the landscape. You asked me once who would kneel next, Sorvath said. I think the answer is no one, not anymore. He glanced at her. You've changed the rules, Dr. Cole. Now we all have to live with the consequences. Marena smiled faintly. Good, she said. They stood there in silence for a while, two people from different worlds, bound together by a moment of defiance and the fragile hope that came after. Eventually Sorvath spoke again, his voice softer. There will be resistance, he said. There will be those who see what you've done as weakness, as betrayal. They will come for you, for me, for everything we're trying to build. Marena nodded. I know, she said, but they'll come whether we do this or not. At least this way we'll have something worth defending. Sorvath laughed quietly, a dry sound that might have been relief. You sound like a revolutionary, he said. Marena shook her head. I sound like someone who wants to go home, she said. But I'll settle for making sure other people can. Sorvath was silent for a moment, then nodded. Then we have work to do, he said. Marena agreed, and together they turned away from the window and back, toward the endless task of rebuilding an empire that had forgotten how to listen. 5 years later, Marena stood in a different room, smaller and quieter, on a colony world at the edge of Kavrathi space. She'd been invited to speak at the dedication of a new communal center, a building funded by local taxes and built by local hands. The crowd that gathered was modest, maybe 200 people, but they listened intently as she spoke about the importance of self-governance and the power of collective action. When she finished, they applauded, and a young woman approached her afterward, holding a data tablet. Dr. Cole, the woman said, I wanted to thank you. My family would have starved if the reforms hadn't come through. You saved us. Marena smiled and shook her head. You saved yourselves, she said. I just helped open the door. That evening she returned to her quarters and found a message waiting from Sorvath. He was ill, the message said, his body finally giving out after nearly a century of life. He was stepping down from the throne and appointing a successor, a younger leader who had worked closely with Marena on the reforms. The crown will pass, Sorvath wrote, but the work will continue. You made that possible. I hope you know that. Marena read the message 3 times, her eyes stinging, and then she wrote back. Thank you, she said, for listening, for trusting, for letting me stand. She sent the message and sat back, staring out the window at the unfamiliar stars. She thought about the moment in the throne room, the weight of the crown in her hands, the way her voice had carried when she'd asked who would kneel next. She thought about the guards who had hesitated, the officer who had spoken of the law, the emperor who had chosen adaptation over pride. She thought about all the small, hard-won changes that had come after, the lives saved and the systems rebuilt, and the fragile hope that had taken root in the cracks of a crumbling empire. She didn't know if it would last. She didn't know if the next emperor would honor the reforms, or if the colonies would hold together, or if the people who opposed her would eventually win. But she knew she'd done something. She'd stood when they told her to kneel, and that had made all the difference. Years later, when historians wrote about the transition period that saved the Kavrathi Empire from collapse, they would point to policy changes and economic reforms and the visionary leadership of the 19th emperor. But those who had been there, who had seen the moment when everything shifted, would tell a different story. They would talk about the human woman who had worn the crown for less than a minute and changed the rules forever. They would talk about the emperor who had listened when he could have killed. And they would talk about the question that had echoed through the throne room and into the future, a question that no one had been able to answer and no one had been able to forget. Who kneels next? The answer, it turned out, was no one, not anymore.